Hi, this is Travis Shaw, Director of Education with the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area. Out in the field today, we've got Ian, the Public Programs Coordinator, behind the camera here, and a man who probably needs no introduction for most of you, our Historian Emeritus, Rich Gillespie. Today we're going to focus on the events of January 10th, 1864. In the early pre-dawn hours of that day, we're going to see a skirmish, a vicious fight between the men of Mosby's Rangers and Cole's Maryland Cavalry up on Loudoun Heights. So as we move through the day, we're going to talk about the events that led up to this fight, the fighting itself up on Loudoun Heights, and then the aftermath and what it meant for Mosby and his Rangers and Henry Cole and his men. And so set the scene for us, Rich. What are Mosby's Rangers up to in the winter of 1864?
One thing to consider is that Mosby's Rangers started out as a fairly small lot in the winter of 1863, but it's a year later. And so we've got multiple companies of Rangers. We're talking now hundreds of Rangers. If you think of the armies, the big armies here in Virginia, they're facing off against each other to our south across the Rappahannock River. And right now, Mosby is still very busy in causing general disruption in the area around Washington. We know that on New Year's Day morning, not a good time to be aroused, Cole's Maryland Cavalry had come into Virginia and had made their way to Upperville and then down into Fauquier at Rectortown. And many of Mosby's Rangers were soon alerted to this fact, and there was quite a fight that developed at a little intersection south of Atoka known as 5 Points. It was a devastating blow, not to Mosby, but to Cole's cavalry.
Right, about 30 or so of Cole's men are captured in this fight. Several are wounded. We know actually one of the wounded men was cared for at the Rector House, VPHA headquarters. So, as you said, a pretty stiff blow to the men of Cole's cavalry.
But it had been New Year's morning. If you think about New Year's Eve, and then you think about how you feel on New Year's morning, then you really don't like being rousted.
We've all been
like
there.
And I think that that's one of the things in the minds of Mosby is that Cole's cavalry have become an important factor in the safety of the Rangers and the smooth running of their operation.
Yes.
We know that in the days right after New Year's Day, there was a major snowstorm here in this section of Virginia, and it left over a foot of snow on the ground, and the temperatures plummeted. During that snowstorm, which actually would have been 158 years ago today, Mosby made an attack on federal troops outside Warrenton. So that's well to the south in the heritage area. But then he's been out scouting after that, and he discovers an important fact, and that is that Cole's cavalry is not currently based across the river, but is actually encamped in Loudoun County, no more than a mile from Harper's Ferry, but on the Virginia side of the Potomac River at a little village called Loudoun Heights. And when he discovers that, that will put things into motion.
So just for a little bit of context, for those who aren't familiar with Cole's cavalry, this is not the first time that the Rangers and Cole's cavalry are going to run into each other. Cole's is formed in the late summer of 1861, a battalion of cavalry, specifically for guarding the Potomac River, doing kind of anti-guerrilla operations here in northern Virginia. They've served extensively throughout the Shenandoah Valley, throughout the Loudoun Valley. They're kind of famous for making these raids into Mosby's Confederacy, picking up Rangers, catching them at safe houses. One Baltimore newspaper even went as far as to say that Cole's men were as useful to the United States cause as Mosby and Lige White are to the Confederate cause. So you can really see them as kind of the flip side of Mosby's Rangers, engaged in a lot of the same activities, have a lot of the same strengths. These are guys raised from Western Maryland who are used to guns, used to riding. Let this car go by. They're guys who have grown up in the area. They know the landscape. They know the people. In fact, many of the men in Cole's cavalry are from this part of Virginia, Unionists who have crossed the river. So there's a little bit of bad blood, I think it's fair to say, between these units.
Absolutely. Stop for a second.
Okay, the reason we cut was because Rich wanted to go and grab this fantastic visual aid that he has. Here we see a photograph of the Harpers Ferry area. You said this was taken in sometime in 1865, Rich?
Yes.
And what you can see is, here's the town of Harpers Ferry where the rivers come together, and this is Loudoun Heights right here, kind of on the right side of the photograph. We can see this nice flat kind of plateau on top of the heights. This is where Mosby discovers that Cole's men are encamped, correct?
That's it. And that's an encampment site that the Federals have used off and on during the war. In particular, if you remember that the Federals had stopped the great advance of General Lee into Maryland in September 1862, right after that, Federal troops fell back to Harpers Ferry. Some 74,000 Federal troops were there about Harpers Ferry. And on that plateau, on that bluff, that was one of the major Federal encampment sites. So, much of the time it was not being used, but then when scouting discovered that's where Cole is, and there is a major road that heads directly from that plateau towards Hillsborough and into the heritage area, the Harpers Ferry Hillsborough Turnpike, that's what led Mosby to think, aha. The question, of course, will become, if there's a major road that leads to that encampment site, would you want to use that road? And if so, how?
Okay, so January 1st, we have the fight at 5 Points. Mosby and Mosby's men defeat Cole's men just outside of Rectortown. And here we are less than 2 weeks later. Now Mosby has decided to put an end to Cole once and for all with an attack on his camp at Loudoun Heights.
That's it. And January 8th, and into the 9th, frigid cold weather. Morning of Saturday, January 9th, when this operation will begin, the thermometer was at 0. And if you think about it, this is Northern Virginia. It does get cold here, but 0 is very cold for us if you're living in a different part of the country. Nonetheless, he called a rendezvous, which is how the Rangers would gather before an operation. And the rendezvous was called for Upperville, one of the key villages within the heritage area. And they met at about 3 o'clock. 100 men showed up, responded to this from various companies. And off they set off in the general direction of Harpers Ferry. Their goal was to come to where we are now, at the little village of Woodgrove, Virginia, which mileage-wise is about 13, 14 miles outside of Harpers Ferry, but a good way station from Upperville if you're heading towards Harpers Ferry.
Yeah, to put this in a modern context, the village of Woodgrove is just outside of the modern-day town of Round Hill, so we're not too far, just north of Round Hill.
And Round Hill didn't exist in 1864, but Woodgrove did.
And Ian, if you want to kind of pan around and give people an idea of what Woodgrove looked like, you see we just have a handful of houses here, and then a rather large house across the street there. And I understand that plays a role in the story that we're telling, right, Rich?
It does. That large house is called Woodgrove, and the village today, 4 houses are still here. The village was named after the house, essentially, so it was called Woodgrove. Today we have a high school named after this intersection. It's a couple of miles away. But that house was lived in by Henry Heaton, who was a prominent farmer and slaveholder. Henry Heaton will go on to be the state senator from this section of Virginia. But Henry Heaton's son, also Henry, was a ranger. And so it was decided that this commodious house with huge fireplaces on a bone-chilling day would be the perfect place to stop. So it was at about 6 o'clock that Saturday, January 9th, that the Rangers arrived at the house Woodgrove. And there, dinner had been prepared, and the fires were roaring, and they were able to thaw themselves out. And good spirits were noticeable in all of the Rangers attending.
Contrast this to Cole's men, who are encamped in tents up on that exposed kind of bluff above the Potomac River in at least a foot of snow. So at least the Rangers had a nice warm meal and a little bit of respite from the cold.
Yeah, that eventually became a still night, but earlier in the day there had been a wind blowing, and from what I understand, that wind was coming sort of from the northwest, and if you're up on that bluff a mile or so downriver from Harper's Ferry, you were probably taking a good bit of that wind. So it was not a pleasant evening for them, and I imagine most of those men heard taps and went to bed fairly early.
Yes. Well, it's a little cold for us out here, so we are going to wrap it up for this leg of our journey, but we will pick up again a little later on as Mosby's men close in on Loudoun Heights.